So our presentation today, obviously as the title suggests, suggested strategies for diverse classrooms. Throughout the district, as I'm working and meeting and helping some of these students, some of the questions that I'm going to try to tackle today are ones that many of you have had or maybe have even just thought about. Questions like, what are some websites, some tools that I can use to help these students? How does my specific content, if you're especially high school, or it can be elementary as well, how does my content cause these students to struggle? What specifically about it, or what's the things that they may enjoy about that content? And what are some concerns or challenges that these students have, and how do I tackle those? But the question that I get the most is, and it's a question that I had at one time, is what exactly is an ESL or an ELL student? And I will do my best to sort of give you a definition of this or try to explain it a little bit. ESL, or English as a Secondary Language, is the teaching of English to people who speak a different language and who live in a country where English is the main language spoken. ELL, or English language learners, are students who are unable to communicate fluently or learn effectively in English. They have a little bit more difficult time, who often come from non-English speaking homes and backgrounds, and who typically require specialized or modified instruction in both the English language and in their academic courses as well. Specifically speaking about our school district, most of the students, virtually all the students currently, speak English pretty well. Matter of fact, a lot of teachers have joked that they actually have better English skills than we do sometimes with our dialect. But nevertheless, I've found that it's not so much it's a communication or dialogue situation that they struggle with the most. Like, you've probably noticed that they were able to carry a conversation. Usually don't have too much difficulty, the students we currently have, with the academic, or with the speaking. It's more the academic, the content that they struggle with. And that's really where I come in right now, that I'm noticing is the breaking down of content. I know, and I'll tackle a little more later, it's like, for example, high school U.S. history, or something like that. They struggle with that a little bit more, per se, than math. And that's kind of obvious with numbers, and I'll discuss that as we go. But English language learners, as I said, tend to have a little bit more difficulty because they're unable to communicate fluently or learn effectively in English. These tend to be students who their native language dominates their home and their lives. That could be any student in particular that this relates to, but their native language is really the dominating force. The English as a secondary language students may be learning English, but as I said, who speak a different language and who live in a country where English is the main language spoken. I noticed that our students have a decent grasp on English. Even if they go home and speak another language when they get home, you've probably noticed, some of the parents don't speak English or very, very little English as far as like when you communicate with them. That's where you notice these differences as, and then the students obviously may be a lot more familiar because they're the ones going to the English-speaking schools. Common difficulties with ESL students, according to, and I'm going to butcher her name, Claudia Pesquet or Claudia PC, students speak more of their native language than English. That sort of varies, as I was just saying. Like with our school district in particular, I don't know how much that holds true. I know some of our students tell me that they don't necessarily speak a lot of their native language when they're at home. Some speak a little bit more than others. I imagine this would be your bigger number districts with ESL and ELL students. I would imagine that would be a much bigger topic. However, the second line I do find, from my experiences, to be true. The younger the student is, the more likely they are to speak their native language most of the time. Maybe not even most of the time, but a lot of the time, where they have the most difficulty with learning English. And they're trying to learn a language, period. I'm talking about the little bitty kids. They're trying to learn a language, period, and the English and the native language battling back and forth can be a much bigger deal than, let's say, middle school or high school students who have one language, I don't want to say mastered, but they're familiar with one language and they're trying to tie in or learn more about another, if that makes sense. No matter what their age or grade level, however, students need to understand that they must, at the very least, try to speak as much English as possible. You'll notice that many of these students who that aren't very familiar with English or are growing with English, they may be intimidated and not want to speak it because they don't feel comfortable. They maybe feel more comfortable, especially when they're around their family. They'll speak more of their native language. Even if it's simple greetings, requests, or statements. Hello, how are you? What is your name? And of course, they'll respond with their name. That's the question you're asking them. Goodbye. Have a good weekend. May I have that? Things of that nature tend to be what you want to do with those students. That sort of helps make them feel comfortable. And as they're learning English, those tend to be things that they are able to answer. Another difficulty, you'll see this a lot as well. I notice it with the older kids than the younger kids. And that comes with the territory of being a teenager or a young adult. Students can be too dependent upon their teacher or classmates rather than doing things on their own. That's that natural. We talk about group work and one student doing all the work and that sort of thing. Imagine having a student who barely speaks English. Like with our school district, we don't have whole classes of ESL or ELL students. So you may have one student in that entire class. If you're doing a group project and of course, you'll try your best to make them feel as comfortable as possible and meet the needs by placing them in a group. Let's say it comes to something like speaking. They're going to feel very, very intimidated by that. And even if they're a very, very smart student, they may still sort of push some of that responsibility off to their classmates. Like I said, they may feel intimidated. Some students, as they go, may get a lot more comfortable with that rather than others. But, speaking in group projects tends to be the thing I notice the most, or speaking out loud in front of a class. You may not see a lot of that. It may not be something you want to do a whole lot, sort of break them into that sort of thing, but they can be intimidated by that. They become disengaged or discouraged when they cannot understand. When they realize that they cannot understand their English-speaking teachers. I don't know how many of you have noticed that, but that is something that could possibly happen. Even if the school has a bilingual teacher, many do not have one that speaks 3 or 4 languages to accommodate all of their needs. Like I said, in our school district, Spanish tends to be the language that we see the most. The most ESL students come from a Spanish-speaking background. But whether you know this or not, we actually have students who speak Japanese in this school district. We have a foreign exchange student from Thailand. We have Russian students, and we recently had Vietnamese students. And these are many different languages, and although they're all broken up, most of these students are broken into different grade levels, 1st grade, 2nd grade. We don't really have a lot predominantly in one grade. That can be a challenge when these students get to a next level or have a teacher who isn't familiar with their language. I know it's very common that many people are. Not everybody knows a separate language. Some people, Spanish, like I said, tends to be the language in the United States that many people are somewhat familiar with, but not necessarily enough to speak it or teach in that language. The book that is used in this presentation heavily, English as a Second Language, ESL and Teaching and Learning, obviously pre-K through 12, has 2 underlying themes. Now, with my history background, the first one I noticed has a lot of connections, and I really enjoy learning about those. And the second one will be more as far as teaching currently. For example, developing in teachers a personal connection to the social and historic presence of ESL immigrant students in our schools. Several chapters, and if you want to become more familiar with English as a secondary language, this is an outstanding book, especially with breaking down, like I said, immigration and the history behind this. For example, and I won't bore you to death with this, but make those connections that on the West Coast, you may see a lot more Asian students. Although there is a large number of Hispanic students, you'll see a lot more Asian, Japanese, Chinese, Korean on the West Coast compared to places like Kentucky, Tennessee, etc. European languages, obviously, are going to dominate the Northeast, the history in the United States. Philadelphia, Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C., maybe even Baltimore, etc. Obviously, and then in the South and Southeast, places like Kentucky, Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, you will see a lot more Spanish-speaking or Hispanic background students, obviously, because that is the geographical connection to those areas. Moving on to our next topic, how do I adapt my specific content to the needs of these students? Now, I grabbed a little bit of this research off a website, Coloring Colorado. It's a really good tool, really good resource for this sort of thing because, like I said, it just has a lot of tools for ESL or ELL students and their teachers and how to help or meet those needs. Language arts. Teaching language arts and literature to ELLs provides rich opportunities for language and literacy development. The thing with language arts that is the most obvious is reading and speaking and listening as well. That's where a lot of, and writing, that's where a lot of those skills comes from. That tends to be where I have a lot of the discussions with teachers, especially at middle school and high school, is the language arts, because that's where you see it the most. You're not going to see a lot of the difficulties maybe in math like you will see in language arts, and I'll talk about that in a second. With the reading, writing, speaking, listening, English, language arts tends to be that area that you see the most concern. Talk about math. Math can be a helpful bridge for ELLs that have studied math in their home countries or in other schools. And like with our students who are already familiar with English, math can be a difficulty for them, but not as much. Like I say, nevertheless, some students will have limited math experience, and all ELLs will need practice mastering the language of math and learning how to understand word problems and use of language in math class for tasks such as explaining the answers. That is where the difficulty in math comes from. It's not so much, the math, and I'm just going to use something vague, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Most of your students are going to be able to understand that. And once they grasp numbers and counting, they're able to figure that out. It comes from the explanation as they move up through grades, the later grades of elementary, middle school, and of course high school, where they have to literally explain the math problem. That is where some of the difficulties with math may come from. The two other main topics within our schools, and of course art and music, comes into this some, but not as much. Like with music, once they learn how to play an instrument and figure out, of course, there's letters involved as well, it's a little easier for them. Of course, art can be as well, but that doesn't mean that there's not writing and reading and speaking involved in these content areas. It just means that some come easier than others. Science. Science can provide exciting opportunities for students to make discoveries and use their language skills, especially through inquiry-based lessons. Science tends, the advantages with ESL or ELL students comes with like the science projects where they're like really hands-on and they're able to figure out things on their own, working in a group, that sort of thing. The difficulties may come from when they have to explain or write out their answers, just like all the other subjects. Social studies, and this tends to be a personal thing with me because of my background as a social studies teacher, tends to be the area that I notice a large amount of our local difficulties. One of the greatest challenges in helping ELLs is to master social studies content is the role of their background knowledge. It's pretty clear why, especially at the high school level, why social studies will be the thing that they struggle with the most. If these students are not from this country or have very little knowledge of the United States, social studies will be very challenging for them. Our students who are English proficient, who are born in this country and have an interest in social studies, they know many of the things that come with our country. Things like the 13 original colonies, George Washington being the first president, even how our government works. These students don't know that. And I don't know if a lot of teachers, grasp that fully in the beginning. It would be like sending you or I in another country and expecting us to already know these things. I know that many of our students struggle with social studies. And there's resources out there. I'm not trying to scare anybody. There's ways to tackle this. We're not all perfect at this, but social studies, there are resources out there. And many of our social studies teachers have solved some of those challenges. And it's just something that we really need to be familiar with. A couple strategies from the book. There's many of these. I have 3 that I'll list. The first one will make a lot of sense. Total Physical Response Method, or TPR. The meaning is right in the title. It emphasizes the use of physical activity to increase meaningful learning opportunities and language retention with students. The students are up moving around. It is successful. It's a successful approach in the beginning for demonstrating comprehension through nonverbal means. You can imagine, that students who struggle with English, that they are able, when they're able to move around, they're able to use those skills in their learning and show their teacher that they are learning whatever it is that it may be. The focus is on meaning and comprehension as well as listening by the students. I like this picture because it kind of shows, some different students sort of demonstrating or acting upon what they're learning. This approach also allows for students, including ESLs, this can also apply to, non-ELLs or ESLs, to acquire language in a manner similar to their first language. Sometimes students feel more comfortable with this method of learning. Not everyone, but many of these students are going to feel comfortable with this because they can be on the same playing field as all the other kids, if that makes sense. In a classroom setting, writing skills, speaking, that sort of reading, they may be a little behind. But they're able to get up and move and show what they're learning or be active in their learning like all the other kids with this method. In addition, when students overcome their fear of speaking out, they then become engaged in classroom discussions, which is where we want them to be. If anything else, this can help break that tension of them being intimidated. The natural approach. The goal is to develop basic oral and written communication skills. The approach assumes that ESL students acquire the target language in several different stages. Similar to how they acquire a first language. In addition, the natural approach is designed to help beginning ESL students achieve proficiency. The best way that I can describe this, and the book describes it like this as well, is it's broken into 4 stages, in sort of step 1 through 4, if you want to call it that. The first one, comprehension precedes production. Understanding before they're able to produce a product. Production emerges in stages. That's sort of what we're doing here. We're kind of going through these stages of learning. Content must be comprehensible and based on communicative goals. Of course, they have to understand, and these students have set goals of what they're able to accomplish, where they should be at the end of the year, for example. They have plans. And activities in classroom environment must work together to produce a lowered active filter. We're trying to do activities where that wall is a little lower for these students, that they're able to be successful. This approach can often be successful because it mixes different strategies and techniques into the learning experience, which is often a good thing, mixing things up, which allows concepts to be recycled in many different ways in order for students to master them. And then here's the last strategy that I will include with this presentation. Like I said, there are many different strategies that you could use for these students, and this strategy will actually include 3 different learning levels, I guess you would say. Representational levels of instructional activities, and this could be far-fetched. Sometimes known as representational knowledge or meditative learning, it is the modes that students use to take in and store information. The process of learning spoken and written language is a developmental acquisition of social and cultural knowledge. The process can be broken into 3 instructional activities. For example, as I was saying, the index learning, symbolic learning, and high order sign learning. This is another one of those we're building up or going to different stages. The first one is index learning, process in which students learn from real, meaningful experiences. I think it's pretty obvious that this is a stage that many ESL students, this is where they start or where they need to be, or where we're trying to begin and move from. They're able to use their hand and real-world experiences and things like that to learn as they go. Symbolic learning, sorting and classifying objects by color, shape, etc. So once they have learned and used their experiences, now we're moving on. Now we're sorting and organizing, that sort of thing. And then the last one, higher order sign learning, creating representations of certain things through identification of letters and their associations with sound and Meaning, now we're building that language. We're learning letters, we're learning sounds, we're putting words together, and eventually sentences, which is where we want these students to be. And the last little bit that I have is some useful websites. Hopefully this presentation is done, kind of sort of simplified or gave you the basic understanding of ESL or ELL students and how to handle that. If you have any questions, you can always ask me more and I can send this presentation out, district presentation, so that every teacher becomes a little bit more familiar with that. Like I said, ESL, ELL is something that's constantly changing. Geography does play a major role in that, but that's not always the case. Our district is small currently with these students, but could grow tomorrow. Most of our major cities see a lot of these students. Most of our bigger towns see a lot of these students, but that doesn't mean that rural areas like where we live in Kentucky couldn't, see an increased number of these tomorrow. And then, you may have a lot of questions at that point. How do I meet the needs of these students? So that's what we're trying to do. Just a couple websites, and as you all know, the internet has an abundance of resources. Most of them are pretty good. Of course, some aren't, but most of them, and there's a lot of free ones out there as well. The first one, Fast Forward, sort of the meaning is in the name. It's a reading assistant component that allows students to choose a book from a large online library, and then with a microphone and headset, read the story aloud to themselves. Students feel a lot more comfortable with this. The program is designed to help with fluency, and this can be used at different levels. Of course, you would maybe see this a lot more at the elementary or middle school level. There is a cost behind that. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but that's a district discussion. And then a free source, especially for the social studies teachers out there. I've used this one before myself. iCivics, the program that can be used for social studies classrooms. Students can complete lessons and play games, all related to how the U.S. government works. Going back to our discussion before, it goes without saying that the ESL and ELL students may have a more difficult challenge with this than other topics. And this is a good resource for having break that down. Plus, think of it like this. It might be something they can help their families with. The more they learn about the U.S. government, they can help their families with achieving their goals as well. ESL Notes offers ESL students written material that can be used in conjunction with watching movies that helps explain idioms and background information about the movie. That's a visual tool you can use.